Hey, I'm Will Lombardi, and I'm here with Eileen Searcy. She's the featured artist at the gallery, the Plumas Arts Gallery in Quincy for the month of March. And it's my privilege to get to interview her today. Welcome.
Thank you.
My first question is sort of biographical. Where are you? What's your background? That sort of thing.
Yeah, I live in Susanville, California. I've been there for about 15 years. I'm a native Californian, but I've lived all over. And I came to quilting through traditional quilting. Quilt artists are interesting in that some of them are trained artists who gravitate towards fiber as a medium, and then others are people like me. I have no professional training, no academic training in art, but I started doing traditional quilting about 15 years ago and quickly discovered the world of art quilting, and it led me to where I'm at and what I'm doing right now.
So what caused that transition? When you say you quickly discovered it, did you see a show somewhere or read about a technique? What happened?
Absolutely. Once I started quilting, I started to devour different things, and one of the seminal publications for art quilters is a trade publication called Quilting Arts Magazine, and it was filled always with techniques. So they would have a little project where you could try out a certain type of glue or a paint or a cutting technique or raw edge versus piecing or something like that, and I just started to try things out and gradually discovered what I really like to work in. I also went to the Pacific International Quilt Festival in the Bay Area, which has been around forever, and it's a giant convention center with a bajillion quilts, and I just walked around with my chin on my chest. I had no idea that things like that could be done. But I had an even earlier exposure, which was very interesting, at the Renwick Gallery, which is part of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. They had a seminal exhibit called Playing with a Full Deck. It's 52 different art quilters, each created a playing card, and it was displayed there. And the same thing, I had never seen anything like it in my life and was incredibly inspired by it. That now is owned by a art quilting museum in San Diego, Visions Art Museum, and they will actually take you in the back and pull the drawers open and show it to you if you ask nicely.
And you've gotten to do that.
I am going to do that. I did not even know they had it until recently, and the director there said, "Oh, next time you come, make an appointment, and we'll go in the back and look at it." So that's pretty exciting.
That is super exciting. And listening to you, I have a few different then questions or comments that I'd love you to build on. My first question is, do you keep 1 foot in traditional quilting and 1 foot in the art quilting world? Or have you sort of gone wholesale into the art quilting world?
I do almost no traditional quilting anymore. Sometimes I'll incorporate small elements into a work that are straight out of traditional quilting, which would mean more piecing, which is, sewing a seam and opening it to create a smooth edge. I do that occasionally in my work, but more than anything, I use applique techniques that involve paint and glue and creating elements that then I move around on the background to create the picture that I want. And I don't make bed quilts anymore, partly just, not that I wouldn't enjoy it, but just out of time. Like, what am I going to spend my time on? I do this.
Yeah, and so then the other part of that is I know that you now, having been inspired by these art techniques, are inspiring others that you have now published in, I think, the very journal you mentioned got you going in this direction. Can you speak about that article and about technique, etc.?
Yeah, it was, I saw torn paper colored on the front and the back, but white in the middle. And when you rip it, you get this white line. And I thought, can I make fabric look like that? And so I developed a technique that uses inexpensive paint along the edge of the element so that you create this white edge. And art quilters are like a lot of artists. We have many ways in which we support one another and encourage one another. It's a pretty small community. And I was at a retreat and I was telling the instructor for the class I was in this technique I had developed, and she just said, "You've got to write an article about that. I've never heard of that." So I wrote a little article and it got into the magazine, which the most exciting thing was the next month somebody wrote a letter in and said, "Here's what I made using Eileen's technique." And it was, that was pretty encouraging. So it is super fun. And I also was at a show last year and saw somebody had used my technique on a piece that was in a show. So that is super fun.
I like that a whole lot, that there's some continuity there and you're extending this line. The other thing that occurs to me is from that article, you say, I forget if you say I love torn paper or if you just say you love paper and you love fabric. And the technique that you're talking about when you work with fabric is this really satisfying thing for you. So I wonder, A, are you working with paper? Or B, what is the draw to fabric as a medium? And then I'm also wondering if, does that lend itself to maybe creating the object, the model for the object in paper first, mapping it out, and then creating the piece? Can you speak to any of those points, or am I opening something up for you?
The difference between paper and fabric is the stitch. And you cannot stitch paper the way you stitch fabric because you can't take your stitches out, because once you've perforated paper, it's perforated for good, whereas fabric is more forgiving. You can move things around, you can cover up where you stitched previously, you can take stitch out. That's one of the big differences between fabric and paper. I have no problem incorporating paper into what I do, and I won't hesitate to do it if it serves the purpose of the piece. But I don't get the same jolt from a pile of paper as I do my incredibly large stash of fabric that I have at home. And it maybe it's primarily the colors, and it's the textural nature of it, the tactile nature of it that I enjoy so much. But ultimately, it's the stitching is the end result.
I love that you bring up color because, as I look behind me, obviously color is significant in your work. Can you sort of speak to how these various parts come together and what role color is playing?
It is definitely one of the driving forces behind what I start to do. So I use examples of colors as a starting point. So for example, I have a series of travel quilts that I've started, and I take my own photos of people, of places that give me geometric shapes to use in the background, and then I'll use one of my photos that has a color scheme that trips my trigger, and that'll start as the driving force behind it. I do my own dyeing a lot of the time, and I do a lot of altering of color using paints. So the fabric is first, but if it's not saying what I want it to say, I have no problem with changing the color by overlaying a sheer fabric like an organza, or applying paint to alter the color. The quilt that's right behind you there is an example of the background is dye painted. So it's just a piece of inexpensive muslin with thickened dye used to paint the background. The red part of it is painted with paint. So I'll use paint anywhere I choose to, but ultimately the fabric is what makes me happy.
So listening to you makes me wonder about your studio, about your workspace, about when you work, where you work, etc.?
I absolutely work every single day. It's a terrible day if for some reason there's no quilting involved in it. And if I literally am not going to be in my house and be able to work in my house, then I have handwork that I carry with me everywhere I go when I'm traveling away from home. I work in the morning. I get up really, really early and I work for at least a couple of hours before I go to work. And people will say, oh, you're so devoted. It's like, it's not devotion, it's compulsion. I mean, it's like I must do that for my day to feel complete. Any day without making something is just not a good day at all. I have a room that's all mine in the house, and now I've taken over both of the extra bedrooms. The children are grown. And then in the summertime, I also have a large workspace in the garage, which is when I do most of my painting. So I lay off of the painting a bit in the winter time just because it's harder to do it in the house. But in the summertime, I do a lot of painting and dyeing out in the garage.
In anticipation for what you might be working on.
Exactly.
Yeah, I get it. So it would be like stretching a canvas and putting some background color on it, what have you.
Exactly.
In effect.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's more experimentation out in the garage. That's really my fun time, and I don't feel compelled to make things for a specific purpose because of some of the things that I make are just no good and they get put aside and maybe another layer of paint will be added another time. I feel pretty free to just play when I'm out in the garage.
I love it.
In the house, if I'm making a quilt, my painting tends to be more focused on getting to a goal of making this element look the way I want, changing that color to make it more the way I want, getting a specific element down.
I love this idea of practice or process and constant work. You know, as a writing instructor, I try to impress that on my students, right? Rather than waiting around for the lightning bolt that may never strike, you create these opportunities, right? And that's what's happening with you, is the compulsion drives you and positions you to be opportunistic when a subject presents itself. Is that true?
Exactly. At the same time, I am constantly looking for new directions to send things, reading books, looking online, participating in the activities. I belong to an organization called Studio Art Quilt Associates, or SAQA. It's an international art quilting organization, has 5,000 plus members.
And that's a web page that you sent me a link for, correct?
Yes. With just anybody who's interested in looking at art quilts will see just the variety of what people produce. It's just incredible the directions that people have taken art quilting. They of course are doing a lot of advocacy to get fiber art treated as fine art, and they're making, I mean, really the strides we've made in the world with getting our art shown as fine art, like is happening here today, it's incredible where we've come.
Yeah, I definitely want to think about that further with you. As you're speaking, I'm sort of wondering I'm wondering about the tools of the trade, as long as we're talking about practice and studio spaces, thinking about the tools of the trade. And then I did wonder if you could speak more to this idea as the art you're making being fine art, and potentially then how you see yourself evolving as an artist within that context.
When we were talking before that we started filming, you asked me about, like, is it an art quilt, is it fiber art? And we have that discussion within SAQA all the time about what do we call ourselves? And of course, ultimately, we're just art. A lot of people are still very comfortable with the term art quilt, but there's probably a trend away from even calling them quilts because they're not very reminiscent of the traditional bed quilt anymore. And so I tend to call myself fiber art because I also like to incorporate wool and paper and a variety of different things other than just fabric. I want to say that one of the most important things is I have a dedicated space that is set up all the time. God bless the quilter who takes their sewing machine up and down constantly and has to clear off the dining room table every night, have dinner on it, and then set up again the next day to do more work. I found that I became much more productive once I had my own space where everything was ready to go. Anytime I could get a few minutes and go in there and do something in my studio space. Stolen moments for sure, especially people who work and have kids and got to fit things in between other things. The thing that makes art quilting different, I would say many art quilters now have no problem with glue and paint and anything they want to incorporate into their art quilt. There's really no boundaries for it. And I definitely use quite a bit of glue. I use fusible applique elements, so I have ironed a glue to the back of my fabric pieces so that I can iron them down to my piece in order to adhere them, and then I go back in over the top and stitch them down. And that's a very common way for art quilters to do their work. Obviously not everybody does it that way, but I use a lot of glue and I use a lot of paint to just again make the elements more and more like the way I want them to look.
You've written the article about this sort of torn paper edge, and I know there's some examples in here. Is there some new technique you're exploring right now, or do you feel like you've sort of found your groove, or what are you thinking about now in terms of technique?
I am working a lot with shears. I am working a lot with organza and layering it, and I see that as an extension of exploration of color, because when you're using shears, you're incorporating the underlying color, the background, and how it interacts with the shear that you put over it, and how that lightens and darkens, and I'm enjoying that a lot of shears in my new work. I'm also exploring some 3D techniques. How do you take what you do with fabric on a two-dimensional piece and turn it into a three-dimensional piece? And it's very exciting. I'm not a sculptor. How do you make a piece of fabric stand up tall? It's super fun.
Wow, I bet.
It is. It's a really great, I'm having a great time with that.
My hope is that you and I are going to get to sort of walk and look at a few of these pieces. And I wonder if part of that discussion could be, do they come from different phases of your career? Maybe a little historiography I'd be interested in, as well as what we're seeing and discussion perhaps of technique. Before we do that though, is there something I should ask you that I haven't? Is there something glaring out that stands out there?
I can't think of anything. You asked about, I kind of didn't answer your question so well about my art versus fine art and how fiber art is moving into that world. I think that it's just been a door that just has cracked open slowly over the last 30 years, and myself and many other fiber artists just keep pushing on that door to get our work into fine arts galleries. And we talk about, maybe we should just quit having quilt shows and at the same time expecting to be treated like fine artists, and just keep pursuing those fine art shows and get people out there. People are always tremendously surprised at what art quilters are doing.
Yeah.
They had no idea that this is what we're working on.
Which I guess brings me perhaps to my last question then about audience. Who do you see as your audience? Who do you hope will purchase your work and give it a place of honor in their home?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think early on, probably like a lot of artists when they're starting out, I made things trying to think of what other people wanted to look at. And I really made a big change in my artistic life when I started to make stuff for myself. That it didn't really matter if other people knew why I had made it that way, what the elements were that went into it. I have a travel series that I'll show you up on the wall that I know everything that went into each one of those quilts about my travel experiences, but probably nobody else recognizes those elements like I do. And I found that people started to respond to my art when I put myself into it and quit worrying about what other people were gonna see in it.
Yeah.
I live in a beautiful place with incredible vistas and incredible physical features, and I'm inspired by that, so it's easy for me to incorporate natural things like volcanoes and lakes and things like that. And so I think that probably a lot of those sorts of pieces are people who live in the area that I do are attracted to them. I hope they would look at that quilt right there and say that makes me think of Lake Almanor.
Yeah.
So I do hope that I meet those people somewhere in between. But some of my travel quilts would be experiences that the people that live near me may never have had. So they may not resonate with that, but it doesn't matter to me anymore. They mean a lot to me, and they express what I want to express, and so it makes me feel good having produced them.
Yeah, and so perhaps the initial feeling doesn't necessarily have to transfer in a 1-to-1 ratio. I'm now able to take it as I want to take it.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, I hope we can take a little walk. I asked you to show us the earliest piece and to give us sort of a sense of your development as an artist. And you said this was one of 2 earlier pieces. So I wonder if you can talk us through it just a little bit.
This is a piece I created called Vishuddha, and it is about the Vishuddha chakra, which is all about expressing yourself. And I was fascinated by a couple of elements. There's numbers involved, and so the flower and leaves express the number concepts that are part of the understanding about the Vishuddha chakra. I love the Sanskrit letters, and that's a good example of just a shape that's cool that I wanted to get into the quilt. But this is an early example of one of my favorite things to do, which is to use a lot of recycled fabrics. These are scrap fabrics that I've dyed, that have come from the thrift store, et cetera, et cetera. And I like to create a heavily textured background with an exciting collage element on top of the heavily textured background. And it includes some of the things that I do to get things where I want artistically, which is if a square of fabric is not exactly the color that I want, I am not above getting out a fabric marker and coloring it in until I've got it exactly the way I want it.
So do you look back at this and what do you see now compared to when you were initially creating it, right? Maybe this isn't one of those early transition pieces, but it is an earlier work.
It's a transition in that I probably use images now that have more personal meaning to me. Everybody loves to work with flowers. There's nothing wrong with working with flowers, but does the flower have a personal meaning to me? Not so much. And as I moved along with my work, I started to use more and more symbols that weren't just interesting to me, but really mean something to me.
I get it. Thank you. Eileen, you and I spoke about sort of the different phases and the different themes. So I wonder if I can ask you, what different subject matter is represented on this wall, and why have you chosen this particular piece to sort of emphasize?
This is one of a series of quilts that I've created from my own photos from my travels. This one is called After School in Urubamba, which is the town at the base of Machu Picchu in Peru. And it includes 3 elements. The background design is based on mosaic tile near where I was staying. The colors came from that. The shapes are based on a view from my hotel room looking down the street, and seeing those angles there, you can see the lines coming through. And of course the figure is a little girl that I snuck a picture of on the street. And I love to tell people the story. I snuck this little picture of a schoolgirl in her school uniform sucking on a lollipop. And right after I took it, she just turned and glared at me. She did not appreciate that at all. So I need to continue with my good manners when taking pictures while traveling. So it's meaningful for me because it brings in elements of so many different things that happened on this trip. Not just one photo of the little girl, but the colors and the shapes and the angles and the lines. And it's impacted my photography when I'm traveling, because I have a tendency now, rather than taking a picture of a thing, I'm looking at a shape or an angle or a color, and somebody else might look at my picture and say, what is she even shooting there? But I'm collecting info to incorporate in later quilts.
Are some of those images potentially, those photographs, are those potentially part of a future show when you're thinking about the finished product and this almost like showing your scrapbook or making a statement about process?
That's an interesting question. Of course, you always run the risk that the photo will outstrip the art piece, but that would be an interesting way to look at this quilt to see where it came from.
Well, I find this so haunting, the way the child gets reproduced in almost as if she's fading or something. It's haunting and beautiful all at once. Is there some, what is happening in that moment that caused you to do that?
That's an excellent question, and I'm not sure I have an answer for that. This quilt evolved itself, and the girl alone wasn't enough. And as it progressed, this is what it became.
Yeah, it's really special, and that progression is powerful.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Eileen, this is one of the larger, it is the largest piece that you're showing. It's incredibly vibrant, but it also appears to be the single or primary example of that torn paper look that you discussed as I was interviewing you. So can you sort of walk us through this technique? Because of all the pieces, this does seem the most tactile as well.
This piece incorporates a lot of different surface design techniques. The foliage is created with painted cheesecloth and tulle. The edges are painted. All the elements have multiple pieces that overlap that make them rise and go down individually. Even the purple part here that is really a more of a sub-element to this. It's heavily appliqued with a lot of different fabrics. This piece to me was all about mystery. This is a mysterious place with a lot of possibilities. What I tried to convey with the size of it and the scope of it is depth and the vastness of the cave, looking up into the sky and seeing the sky out the hole. It's rocky, it's created with paint and tool up here. The torn edge technique, the role that it plays is defining edges. So it's just as a painter would use a line, it creates a line wherever those collage elements are overlapping one another.
Why did this particular idea strike you as needing that defined line? And in particular, could you not achieve that with a stitch of a different color? You know, what compels you to make that line and to do it in this manner?
I think one of the elements is that the paint that I use is a dimensional paint, and it's raised. So it has texture that stitch does not. Stitch tends to push things down, whereas the paint raises it up. And so it stands up and away rather than being pushed down further into the fabric. When you're quilting the background, obviously depending on the color of the thread you use, it makes a difference, but when you're quilting into the background, the more you quilt, the more it recedes. And this brings up the edge rather than making it recede.
I see. And so then, is this the type of piece that is leading you towards the three-dimensionality that you spoke of earlier?
Definitely the painted edge technique that I use and the use of thick interfacing to help elements rise up is a big part of the 3D work that I'm doing right now. Partly because that interfacing also gives stiffness. And it's amazing how stiff an art quilt can be in reality, and yet it doesn't look stiff, it looks soft.
Oh, I love that. So you're really playing with the feel and the texture, etc.
That's part of where the stitch comes in. So you can see in these elements up here, they have a lot of stitch on them, and the rising and falling of the puckering that happens naturally when you stitch through layers, that texture that it gives it is part of what makes it look like the rocky ceiling. This is also a good example of me and my color palette. I absolutely don't feel compelled to use realistic colors at all. Obviously cave walls are not purple, but I can do that if I want as an art quilter, so I can make it any color I want. I like that.
Well, I love it. This is wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you.
So, Eileen, we're still on the subject of travel. The last three pieces we've looked at are part of a travel as subject matter. And so can you tell us something about the inspiration behind this, the figures in it, etc.?
Again, I use three elements in this quilt as the inspiration. Obviously a photograph of some men working during our travels, walking away from me. The color scheme is from a picture of a lunch that we had at somebody's home along the Nile River in Egypt. The believe it or not, the blue is actually the tablecloth, and yet when it got into the quilt, it's more now the river. But I know it's the tablecloth. That's what it means to me. And there was a beautiful tomato and a lemon on the table.
Wow. And
the background quilting includes that half lemon sitting on the table. And this is the sail of the felucca that we rode on in the Nile in the shape of the boat. So it's an abstract composition with hidden meaning for me. Somebody else would never know, oh, that's a felucca sail, but it means something to me. And I don't do anything when I'm working that I don't enjoy. If I try a technique and it's not fun, I drop it from my repertoire because life's too short to be doing things that seem like work instead of fun. So if I'm working on something and it just makes my heart sing because it reminds me of a fabulous day riding on a sailboat in the Nile, that makes the work so enjoyable. And this is another example of my technique using shears. They're made out of a yellow organza, and that way you can see the composition behind them. It's also a little bit melancholy in that these are figures of people that are working hard. I'm a tourist there. They're walking away from me. They're not interacting with me. I'm just observing their life. And after I made it, I realized it felt a little wistful, the way that they are transparent and turned away from me.
When you set out to make this piece, it doesn't sound like that emotional content, the wistfulness, was present. So in the process of making a piece like this, where you can't paint over something or what have you, can you in some way sort of map out where this began and to the piece that we see today?
Sometimes the piece will progress in a direction that I hadn't really planned out. I have an idea of what it's going to look like. The colors that I use are definitely set in the planning, and the background shapes were set in the planning, and then the quilting comes in next. And with the technique that I'm using right now, with the heavily quilted abstract background and the transparent figures on them, it's sometimes the addition of the figures starts to really move it in a direction that I didn't necessarily plan out. Because this could have been one large guy in the center of the quilt.
Yeah.
Would have been a completely different feeling than the two men walking together, and a little bit smaller, and they're a little bit farther away. When I was making this, one thing I like about the technique I'm doing right now with the organza and the outline stitching is I can flip my figures. I can have them pointing in different directions, and I can create a composition. The background's done, the figure has been created, and I can move them around quite a lot. And one of the things that I did very consciously was I had them sort of facing each other because I wanted it to show them walking together. They are two working guys walking together. And that freedom to adjust when I'm in the middle of making the quilt is a really fun aspect of this technique that I've been using lately.
This is delightful, but I also sense that wistfulness or some degree of melancholy in it. What a delight. Thank you.
Thank you.